Welcome to Talknomics, the podcast where the sharpest mind in business, finance, and economics break it all down. We sit with business leaders, expert drivers, expert advisors, and economic thinkers to unpack the forces shaping Nigeria's economy, markets, and your money. We're going to have insightful and real unfiltered conversations. And of course, I'm always going to be having super guests on this show. My name is Ugodre, and we do this every week on this channel. Of course, if you're not following Nairametrics, do follow Nairametrics TV on our YouTube channel. Of course, follow Nairametrics on any social media handle as well. I have here today a very, very special guest, an eminent person, one of the most respected economists in Nigeria. Super proud to have him in the studio, someone that I highly, highly respect. We have here today Dr. Biodun Adedipe.
I'm happy to be here.
Good to see you, sir. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank
We've
so
been on the
much.
same panel several times, but
Indeed,
now I'm the one asking the questions instead of them asking us the questions.
Okay.
Good to see you, sir.
A pleasure.
All right, what a world so far. I think we're together earlier in the year and we're trying to project Nigeria, the global economy, and I think to a large extent, some of the things we said will happen is happening.
Indeed.
But let's just start first with you. I mean, you've been covering Nigerian economy for decades now. Your papers, your ideas have basically been used not just by governments, by companies as well. But just a little bit about you. What would you say is your own economic ideology? Are you to the right or are you to the left? Are you center? Because economics tend to always be either right or left or center. So how would you describe yours?
Well, I will describe myself as simply development focused.
Okay.
And it also comes from my background, because my specialization, my doctorate was industrial economics, but now specifically drilling down to corporate finance. Let's talk about capital structures. Okay. How do companies in Nigeria get funded? Is it through equity mainly or through debt or a combination of both? And then how one could make sense of that and now project forward. How does that support the economy? So everything ultimately is about development. So that is what I will position myself.
Okay, it looks like you're playing center here. So that sounds like center to me, so long as it leads to development, isn't it? I mean, but we're seeing the world change. Just recently, Donald Trump has pushed out, unleashed a global tariff war, as some people are calling it, because he wants to protect American jobs. And it kind of looks like it's upending everything the world has believed in, particularly when you talk about capitalism. We've often talked about, globalization.
That's right.
We've often talked about global trade and allowing countries, to trade based on what they're competitively good at, right? We've talked about how global trade reduces cost and inflation and all that. I mean, these were all creation of the United States. But what is Trump trying to do, and what is behind all this? And where are we going to today?
Okay.
In today's world.
Now, we put it simply this way. I use the word globalization. Now, what the agenda Trump seems to be pursuing, to me, is de-globalization. Which in fact began during COVID in 2020, when because of the disruptions to global supply chains, and a lot of countries began to look inwards. And I'll give very quick examples. And I will take the first one from America itself. And recall also that then it was Trump 1.0 that we had. We didn't believe that there was really COVID-19 as a pandemic, as it was declared to be in March 2020. And so based on that, he believed that the way the countries responded to it made everyone seemingly to depend so much on China, And so for him, therefore, it was about, look, let me declare a martial war law that will now enable factories in the US to be converted from their regular manufactures into producing to support the quote and unquote warfare. So, and of course, it was basically to start producing ventilators, all right, at the time. And of course, when it began that, other countries now where I will use United Arab Emirates. We now said, look, we've all depended on China and other countries for face masks. So at some point, UAE now declared that, look, we no longer import face masks. All the face masks we use in UAE will be produced internally in our country. So that was when we began to see the traces of de-globalization. So now what Trump 2.0 has come to do, and his key functionaries have declared that openly, is to now reverse globalization. In which case, their own concept of MAGA, Make America Great Again, is to produce what Americans consume internally, which of course runs against the grain of what we have always known, the global economy, global trade, the flow of goods, the flow of capital, and even labor, over the decades. That all of those are now to be reversed. They're thinking that by offshoring manufacturing, we're also offshoring jobs. And I give a very interesting joke here. I think I heard it was Tom Peters that made this joke about 21 years ago, when he had this book published then that he called Reimagine. And then he did a one-hour video on the book. So in one of the lines he said in that video, he stated that when he was young, what his own parents used to tell him, it was to get serious with his life because he had access to food. But the children in China, they were hungry. Okay? But they're now in his own generation as a parent. What he tells his children is no longer that the children in China are hungry, but that they are hungry for their jobs.
Oh.
That was the way Tom Peters
for his children's jobs.
For his children's jobs. That was 21 years ago, 2004. So, and I look at what Trump 2.0 is doing now, and it occurs to me that he thinks that jobs that ordinarily American children should be taking are being offshoring to China and mostly East Asia and the rest of the world. So for him then, he looks at MAGA as, let me address that issue, which of course is a challenge for us in Nigeria as well.
Yeah.
Where we say we consume what we don't produce, and then we produce what we don't consume. But ironically, even in that context, America is at an advantage.
Exactly.
Which he himself and his team don't seem to correctly interpret. Because we are in a world where we are largely interdependent, whichever way we look at it. Which is why we say, there's another way I will put it very simply, that okay, somebody had a road accident, riding in a BMW, but the road where the accident occurred is somewhere in, let's say, France, just for illustration purposes. Now, what was the problem? This person was running away from paparazzi.
Okay.
And the paparazzi were riding on Honda motorcycles, made in Japan.
Made in Japan.
The camera they were carrying were Samsung, made in South Korea. All right? Now, rushed to the hospital, and then the medication to be used to treat him was from Brazil.
Wow.
We now say, okay, that incident alone is enough to illustrate globalization.
Global trade. Yeah.
Which means, look, we all depend on one another. That's the reality today. So if you now want to reverse that, it's not something you can reverse with just a stroke of the pen, executive order. It will create chaos, which is what we are witnessing today. So in my view, therefore, his approach to it is not strategic. That's the way I would put it.
So, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree that Donald Trump is very rational when he's making decisions. I think that is what his base really likes about him. And there's nothing he's doing now that he never said he won't do. So he's doing exactly what he said he will do. So he's upending the world completely. What do you think the world is going to look like 5 years from now? Are we actually going to deglobalize, or are we going to see countries just ride this storm and then say, you know what, this guy is likely going to leave in the next 3 years. Let's just ride this storm. Because, I mean, we're always going to take years for this to unwind. Or is this just going to be the norm?
Yeah, the reason I laughed when you were saying this is because I had a leader in the East Asia make that remark that, look, this guy will be there for maybe another 3 years, as a few months. Let's ride out his storm. And then when he leaves, hopefully somebody that takes over after him will come back to the table to do proper negotiation, not pushing and forcing his agenda down the throat of everybody. That's on the one side. But I see it more from this perspective. Number one is what will happen to global trade. Then secondly, what will happen to the global economy? If I go by the remarks made by, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala at the World Economic Forum that held earlier this year, she said their projection at WTO is that this will make global trade to contract by, I think, about 3%, she said, and the global GDP contract by about $6 trillion. So that now is what we, at the first instance, estimate to be the impact of it. So in which case, if this writes out the way Trump envisions it, that is how it will affect the global economy, which means it will affect everybody.
Correct.
So but the response now is, what do we do to ensure it doesn't affect us that way? And that's another interpretation I'm giving to it. There will be a shift in the flow of trade, no doubt. And then, of course, we may actually see the deleterious effect not as deep as Dr. Iweala envisioned it to be. The sense that, when you go, let me go a little bit strategic now. Okay, in strategy, we say that it is an art, ART, of conducting warfare, the art of being a general. That's what we say the war strategy is. Okay? What is the art of being a general? That means if you're an army general, you fight different battles that now eventually define as a war. So your ultimate aim is to win the war. And then we separate between strategy and tactics.
Okay.
Strategy is what you plan while you're in the war room. Okay. Tactics is what you do when you are confronted with the enemy at the battleground.
Correct.
So now the enemy has come to the battleground with all these announcements of the tariffs. Okay. So how do you respond? So I see different countries responding different way depending on the geography where they are. What will make sense, for example, for African countries to do is to look inwards and take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, open borders within Africa. So let's do more trade with ourselves. I see the same thing happening more in Europe, same thing happening more in Asia. So, and of course, in South America. Previously, Mexico, US, and Canada were in the same trade bloc.
They had that trading bloc. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but Trump has dismantled that now, as it were. So Mexico will now realize that there's a need to align with other South American. Countries. And then, of course, Canada is like a victim that's still trying to find its muzzle. If you go by what the Canadian leader said yesterday, that yes, this will affect us, no doubt. I mean, there's not much we can do about the impact. But rather, let's look now at what we can do to protect ourselves. So we can face the reality. So, but most other countries fall within certain blocks. Oceania may be small, and the smallest trade region globally, 5 of them. So, but in their own instance, what this speaks to is that you look inwards. But even looking inwards, you now we pick Nigeria. And that's why it becomes interesting for me. And I've been advocating this over a couple of years. Not even knowing that Trump 2.0 will happen.
That's what will happen.
Okay? And that is, Nigeria should have, before now, taken a position to take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Agreement in this manner. And I said, take a look at, let's say, the top 20 African economies.
Okay.
Look also at their trade data. What are their top 20 imports? Where are those imports from? What are the quality specifications? So are there entities in Nigeria producing similar products?
Okay.
What do they need in order to strengthen them to be able to outcompete the countries where those products are coming from to Africa? So in which case, within Africa itself, you are positioning Nigeria and the producers in there. So our competition is done all over the world, and we don't take it seriously in Nigeria, is that governments go to manufacturers, not wait for manufacturers to come to them. They go to them and ask, what do you need? How can we help you? Because bottom line is that you are in warfare. Everything is about coming, even physical war. I did a simple analysis of the war taking place in Europe, the Russia-Ukrainian war. And when it broke out in February 2022, I said, look, let's look at it. The bottom line is economics.
Of course.
But people didn't see it as that. And I said, okay, let me clarify it for you. It's a physical war. You agree? They said, yes. Okay, fine. Where is it taking place? They said, inside Ukraine. I said, okay, fine. So that means it has a location physical. Now, if a war is taking place in a geography physically, then certainly infrastructures are being destroyed. Where is that happening? Said inside Ukraine. Say, good. Next thing, houses have been destroyed. They say, yes, okay. People also die. Where are more people dying as a result of the war? They said, in Ukraine. Say, good. Now let's go economics. I said, now, where you fight a physical war, you need weapons. And I said, where is most of the weapon coming from?
From the West.
From the West, all right? Now, any weapon taken out of the armory to prosecute a war, normally, in military practice, you have to replace. Now, to replace those weapons, you issue out contracts to the defense industry. And so that means the fundamental beneficiary from the war are not those fighting. It's the defense industry that will replace the ammunition and weapons being taken out of the armory to prosecute the war. Everything comes down to economics.
Interesting.
And I said, at the end of the day, this is 3 years after, that they will come back to the negotiation table to resolve this matter. It's happening now.
Yeah.
So everything comes down to economics when you do proper interpretation.
Even in warfare.
Even in warfare.
So what does this mean for Nigeria, though? What do you think? Is Nigeria going to be the casualty in all of this, in this new world order? Or are we, the way we're going, do you think we'll be a casualty if we don't change? Or are we in the right direction that perhaps we could be winners?
Well, from what one read in the news, the snipers here and there, that the Federal Executive Council is going to meet and deliberate on all of this. I would think we should have done that earlier than now. I mean, the moment Trump was sworn into office, even before he was sworn into office, immediately he won the election. We should have rolled out that strategic, approach to it. That look, he has won the election, 20th of January will be inaugurated, and this man said everything was going to do. So that was the way we in the business world interpreted it. Said, okay, if this man went this way, what will happen? It will affect global trade. It will destroy supply chain, global supply chains. It will also affect global trade and then bring it down. How will that affect the US itself? So if he introduced tariffs, that means imports into the US become more expensive. That will trigger inflationary pressures. If that happens, what will the Fed do in response to that? Fed had been mulling the idea of reducing rates, seeing that inflation had become tempered a little bit. But the fear that this one would also, trigger fresh inflationary pressures, the Fed will hold back. If the Fed holds back, what happens? That means rates in the US will still remain a little elevated. And in fact, if they now have to also respond to elevated inflation rate, then it means Fed will take rates up. If rate goes up, then we go to monetary policy side. Then we call it normalization. So all those that invested in emerging markets and developed economies like Nigeria will start migrating out and go to the US because, dollar-denominated assets will become attractive. If that happens, that affects financial markets at this end. That's one side. The other side is your loan book, external debt. Because as your currency begins to weaken, we play back the global financial crisis of 2008. What happened then? Within the space of 7 months in 2008, 40 currencies lost value against the US dollar at that time. In fact, that was what our then central bank governor also considered when CBN came out with devaluing the Naira from about 118 to 132 Naira. And I recall then I asked a question at a meeting he came here in Lagos for. I was one of those invited to the meeting. And I asked, if 40 other countries devalued their currency, was that enough reason to devalue the Naira? And brilliant economist Soludo is. They now brought out the data. And they said, look, at that point in time, Nigeria was hemorrhaging. All we're earning from crude oil, condensate, associated gas, as a major export, was already reducing to between $3 and $4 billion monthly. And that foreign capital exiting was around $7 billion monthly. So that means there was a net of anything between $3 and $4 billion monthly. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. Between April and November, because we had that meeting end of November, early December. I said, okay, let's take the number of months involved here. That's like 8 months. So multiply 8 by 4. That's $32 billion that exited Nigeria, which meant when I saw external reserves dampen from the height, that the peak of $64 billion thereabout that we had. So it became very clear to me that one thing is important to Nigeria, managing investor confidence. We are there today. We need to manage that. And that's already what we are seeing in the FX market. Naira losing value between last week and now, despite central bank's intervention of almost $200 million. Okay? So that means we need to manage investor confidence. We need to also create narratives that are more positive about the economy. But that comes by a clear indication of how you are responding. So then also interpretation of the data correctly. What's the nature of our trade data? What does US buy from us? Largely crude oil. And maybe some refined products. Then fertilizer, that's urea, and maybe, a few other items. But when you look at that, the question to ask is, what US imports from us is largely crude oil, and that is not impacted by tariffs. That's been a global practice for decades.
Yeah.
Anything crude oil, refined products are exempted from tariffs. That means that portion will not be impacted. So for those, therefore, who are responding to this, say, Nigeria is going to be affected by this, they are not correctly interpreting the data. Now, the 8% non-oil export that we have, you then ask yourself, how many of the items there actually go to the US? Okay? So, and then, on the back of that also, which of them are actually impacted by this tariff of 14% that Trump announced for Nigeria? So it is limited in volume. And that gives Nigeria some measure of room and confidence to put together a strategy to respond to this. And part of that also, yes, in the policy, he said his government is going to wind down AGOA by September this year.
Yeah.
And then you ask yourself the question, to what extent has Nigeria benefited from AGOA?
Not really, not much.
Not really, not insignificant. So in which case, we should now be talking about how to strengthen Nigeria for global competitiveness at the bottom line. And that's why I love China, because China is very strategic in its response. I've had occasions to play China's strategic plan for development for our leaders, political leaders. Sometime in 2008, I was involved in something we called Infrastructure Nigeria. And we sent it then to the presidency. We had President Yar'Adua then as our president.
Yeah.
And what we posited then was that Nigeria should try and come up with an infrastructure plan that would be about 10% of what China has done. And I came by that by looking at the land mass of Nigeria
to China.
And land mass of China is ratio 1 to 10. And then played back on that. The convention I was involved in Paris in March 1990. The theme of that conference, Hugo, was how to make Africa the manufacturing ground for the world. 1990 March in Paris. I was there as a delegate. Okay? So I now said, as at that point in time, 2008, China was already the manufacturing ground for the world. Which means what we envisioned for Africa 18 years before, China had become it. And what did they do? What they simply did was basically 4 key elements in infrastructure, hard ones. And that is roads, railways, dry ports. And then they laid it out in 2004 and said for roads, we have a 30-year plan for roads. Okay? Expressways. We are targeted to deliver 85,000 kilometers of expressway over that period of time. And the target is that we have newer and, of course, more strategic expressways than the US. That they had the longest stretch in the world, 75,000 kilometers. So China had a competitive mind from the beginning. Let's do expressway longer than US
Yeah, US.
75. But now for me, I brought it to myself, okay, let me even look at that vis-a-vis Nigeria. Nigeria constructed the first expressway before China. And that's the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. Commissioned in 1978. 120 kilometers. Okay? The first expressway constructed by China was 18 kilometers only.
Wow.
And that was delivered in 1998, 20 years later.
What?
But today we speak about over 140,000
Thousand.
kilometers of expressway in China. All right? We are not even near year 2034 that they talked about. Then they looked at railway and said, let's build railway system that we also outcompete the country with the longest stretch of railway in the world, which at the time was Russia, 2004. And they said, we are targeting 2012 to deliver that. And interestingly, because I follow this, it's easy for me to put dates to these things. They said 2012. Yes, by 2012, China achieved it. I was on holiday in England when a train arrived in London, carrying manufactured goods all the way from China. Over 3,000 miles on the rail. Because I watched it live on Sky News. They tied the ribbon in front of the engine. And they said, this is straight from China, now arriving London. Okay? So I can relate now with all those components. Then dry port. China, as at 2008, had 132 dry ports. The concept is that, look, if you have expressways 4x8, because that was the design, and then you have railway 4x4, and then put dry ports all over within the hinterland, it means you can site your factory anywhere in China without having to worry about logistics.
So the entire infrastructure was built for exports?
It was built for exports. So it's not an accident that China is where it is today. Now, play it back on how China is responding to Trump's tariff wars. China now has the muscle to be able to do that. Because even if they no longer sell that much in the US because of the tariffs, they have the rest of the world. And China also approached that strategically again, I would say. Because a couple of years ago, I think about 12, 13, 14 years ago, they began with the Belt Road Initiative, BRI.
Yeah.
Where they now help emerging economies and developing economies to build their physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
So not only has China been empowering them in that regard, but also gaining the goodwill, all right? So that when there is an all-out trade war like this, most of those countries will look the way of China, that they got more help, more support to develop in an inclusive manner than they got from the West. So now while China was doing all this, the West was still relying on the old model of development, and which is to look at the rest of the world as, what you might say, the periphery. When we were in school, studying economics in those days, we knew metropolis and the periphery. The metropolis was the West. Nigeria and other African countries were the periphery.
African countries like Nigeria.
So the idea was get raw materials from the periphery, ship it to the metropolis, then they use it and send back the finished product to you. You spend more money buying the finished product, you get so little for what you export to them.
Incredible.
So whereas China has now come and said, look, even if you will not allow us export to your country, the first attempted what the Japanese did. US has done something like this
Japan,
also.
During Reagan's era.
Exactly, 1982. When US said, look, because Chinese automobile manufacturers are so competitive, we will not allow more than 2 million units of Japanese vehicles to come into the US. That was a non-tariff barrier, as you call it. But Japan didn't complain. All they did was, okay, we have plenty of trade surplus. They started buying up factories in Europe and also in the US. So because that restriction didn't affect Japanese vehicles manufactured inside US territory.
Yes.
That was their response.
Yeah.
So China now modified that and said, okay, if there's a restriction on what we export to US from China, let's go set up factories elsewhere. At least if set up factory, let's say in Africa, there won't be a restriction
Yes.
on what we produce in Africa
Yes.
that goes to the US.
Yes.
Which I think is what informs the cancellation of AGOA. Because US is looking at that and say, okay, these guys may likely, the export may begin to happen from Africa. So let's cancel AGOA, So all of these, that's why I said we must be strategic in our response. So we can't just go on what we learned in university in our own days. I think the same thing will work today. It's a different world entirely. Completely different.
Okay, so this now brings me to Nigeria, and I mean, listening to you just go through, the economic history, particularly between Nigeria and China, it makes me wonder, why did it go wrong for us? What was the economic ideology that Nigeria has, put forward over the years that really hasn't worked? I mean, you've studied this economy for years.
Yeah.
Is there something that we did wrong? Is it political, or is it just?
I won't put it only as political. Political is an angle to it, okay? But we have not, as a people, united around what I would call an economic vision.
Haven't we had too many of that?
We've had visions.
Vision, these needs and all that.
But the way they were done, it was not what I would say every Nigerian bought into. It was always seen as their vision.
Okay.
Because, I was privileged to be a part of Vision 2020. I didn't do much about 2010, okay? But when it came to 2020, and I still say this to anybody that cares to listen, because I was there. The whole idea started from Soludo. Because he read the report of Goldman Sachs in their interpretation of reforms that Nigeria began in 2004. And they said, on the back of these reforms, they have identified also 11 countries that they branded as next 11. The idea being the G7, which are basically the West, and then the BRICS, which are originally four. Brazil, Russia, and China. Make 11. So next 11 was where Nigeria's name came up. And the idea now was that they said next 11, that Nigeria's reforms is population, the market, and of course, combined with the reforms, we throw up opportunities for global investors. And now looking also at what happened to the BRICS, that's their stock markets, between 2001 and 2004, growing between 423% and 640%. So that these are the countries that can throw up such opportunities for global investors. So now, Soludo read that article, and they called for a meeting of the top management of CBN. Then they invited 3 or 4 from outside to join them at the meeting. They now posited that, look, if truly this happens, 11 plus G7 and the BRICS, 4 of them, that will make 22. Why should we aim to be the last among the next 11? Let's aim to be at the very worst, number 9 among the next 11. So that will make us 20th in the world. And he said, is it doable? I was the first to raise up my hand at that meeting. You know the way it is. CBN governor is so powerful. Chairman of the board, CEO. So most of the senior management there, they were watching because they didn't know the direction it was going. But when I raised up my hand, others also did, And then, I said, okay, we are going to aim to be the 20th largest economy in the world by year 2020. That was how it started. But we called it then the financial sector strategy for year 2020. So they put out, adverts. My company eventually won, the slot to lead the credit market team. So the concept then was that we use credit to grow this economy to that position in year 2020.
Okay.
So the idea then was that we are going to restructure and rearrange the credit market in Nigeria so that credit will become available, accessible, and affordable. We call it democratized credit.
Okay.
That if we did that, that will help this economy to grow and achieve about $963 billion GDP by year 2020. And therefore rank as number 20 in the world.
$963 billion GDP, which is almost $1 trillion.
Exactly. That was our target in 2007. Okay? So, and of course, having said that, there were several other things that we needed to do. So we had other thematic, groups. We were 12 in number. Our company handled the credit market. which was just one. And of course, we have others also involved. So the idea then was to restructure the economy at the time toward that goal. Infrastructure will play its own role too. We also said power, generation, and delivery, not just to generate. We said we're targeting 40,000 megawatts of power by year 2020, which of course, when President Adua came into office, I made a remark on that at a discussion of the budget for 2007. You know, he inherited that from Obasanjo.
Yes.
And then did his own in 2008. My comment on that budget, I said, look, if we're going to have the budget as truly an implementation tool for our plan, development plan, then there must be a connection between each year's budget and the development plan that we have.
Of course.
So I now use that to illustrate. I said, look, let's move away from measuring how much we spent at the end of each fiscal year. Instead of measuring what was spent, let's measure what was delivered. In which case, whoever the minister works, what will be measuring for him or her will be the number of kilometers of road delivered, how many bridges were constructed, just like China did, and delivered infrastructure. I now use power to illustrate. I say, okay, we have a 40,000 megawatts power generation and delivery for year 2020. We were then doing about 3,400 megawatts at the time. And I said, if we are going to hit that, let's look at the interval, 2008 to 2020, 13 years. I said, let's have it as a target, therefore, to add 3,000 megawatts annually. Which, if we achieved, would have added 39,000 to the existing 3,400, and that will comfortably take us above 40,000 by year 2020. And interestingly, even though an outsider to the government, the thing got to President Yar'Adua, and he gave the Prime Minister a target that year, 2008. This can be fact-checked. Yar'Adua gave the Prime Minister a target of 6,000 megawatts for 2008.
Of incremental increase?
Incremental of 3,000. So the idea was we must end 2008 December at 6,000 megawatts. We were 3,400. So if we added 3,000, we would have completely gone above 6,000 by the end of that year. He did it. And I said, if we change the way we were now running Nigeria, and at the heart of this question you asked me, that would have changed everything between then and now, where we no longer be talking about how big a budget is, and then we evaluate at the end of the year and we say, how much did we spend? I recall vividly, I think that was in 1995, January. You know, it was Abacha then as our head of state. And they put out how much they spent in 1994. And they said they had a surplus of 1 billion naira there. It was a big sum.
Yeah.
I did my analysis and gave interview to the media. I said, no, the data they put out, which I analyzed, doesn't show a surplus. It was a deficit. Nobody abused me from the presidency. All I received was a carton of documents for the presidency that I should review those documents. And I took my time. I went through everything. I wrote back a rejoinder that this data that I have here, that you sent to me, my position has not changed. And that was where I ended.
This was when, in 1995?
1995. I was not arrested. Nobody abused me. I was just doing my job, JJ, in one corner, like that. Okay? So it's been, since that time, I've been advocating this. That we should stop measuring how much we spend. Let's measure what we deliver. That will change our development narrative. And now also, our ministers look across all the MDAs. Let's begin to define their retention in office or exit by their deliverables. If you're expected to deliver this particular number, let's even pick under transportation, Nigeria Railway Corporation. How many corridors should be in operation? You run, let's say today, you run from Lagos to Ibadan, or perhaps the most successful today in Nigeria. How many trips do we make along that route in a day? And that's a route that has a lot more passengers than what NRC is conveying. So those are the kind of things we'll be talking about. Setting targets for ourselves and pursuing them. So then it means if a minister will be retained in office, it will be because he or she has delivered. And then if he or she will be redeployed or dropped from the cabinet, it should be based also on performance.
Mm-hmm.
So the moment we begin to do that, every of our top government functionaries, we know that it's not about, oh, it's my turn now, I've been appointed in the office. It will be about, look, I will retain this office if Nigerians can touch what I deliver. So that is important. It's been missing over the years. And then, of course, sustainability.
Okay.
Because once a government changes, whatever the previous government was doing becomes dropped. That was why about 2 years ago, we did a count. We had over 30,000 abandoned projects across the different tiers of government in Nigeria. Almost 40,000. Okay?
Over how many years?
Over so many years. Okay? So for me then, the reason that happens is because there's no continuity. So Ugo comes into office after Biodun. Ugo says, all those projects are Biodun's projects. I'm going to start my own. So that has been a major problem with Nigeria.
Both at the federal and the subnational
federal,
levels.
subnational, it's the same story. So until that also changes, we may not see the kind of sustainable, inclusive, and sustained growth that we've been dreaming for Nigeria. That's where the problem is for me.
Okay, so let's come down to the recent current government. I think we've seen a lot of infrastructure spend. I think they mostly appears to follow a lot of deficit-based financing. And according to you, you're saying, look, let's not look at surplus or deficit as a way to measure government performance. Let's look at it from a point of view of what you've actually delivered.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've also seen the government adopt some kind of market approach to economic policy. So exchange rate, flexible exchange rate, removal of fuel subsidies, and removal of subsidies in general, at least mostly. Yeah. So mostly market-based approach to their governance. How would you describe this current government's approach, and does it in any way mirror what you think would get us to, or put us on that roadmap to the Nigeria that you've always dreamt of?
Yeah, I will say upfront that we are on the right course.
Okay.
Right course because we have chosen some things to do that are not orthodox by Nigerian history. If you look at the history of Nigeria, starting with our first development plan of 1962 to 68, and then the one from 70 to 75, where we got that truncated. At some point, we came back and began to do what we call perspective plan. That again got truncated. We began now to plan medium term mostly. Even medium term plans, we are not fully committed to it. So now, if you look at that history, we service what the current government is doing. And I'll put it this way. Let me use this analogy. When COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in March 2020, what we did in our company was to say, let's sit back. How will this play out around the world? How will it affect countries? How will it affect industries and sectors of the economy? And then how should players in those sectors respond? And we identified that for every entity anywhere in the world at that time, the first consideration should be survivor. So after you survive, the next stage will be stability. And then the third stage will be to restart growth. That's the way we put it. So under each of those, what are the specifics in terms of initiatives that every company should consider? So we then said, okay, for governments, and that was a time I also learned a lesson. You know what I discovered? That there's no expert anywhere in the world. That was what that crisis taught me as a person. And this why
no expert anywhere in the world.
No expert anywhere in the world. Because at some point during that period, there was a webinar I was invited by Nigerian Deposit Insurance Corporation to do. And when I got on that platform to speak, I found that there were 54 countries there. They had their own deposit insurance corporation across 54 countries, including the US. FDIC was there. So, because what they wanted me to do was interpret COVID-19 how it will affect economies, how it will then come to affect the bank industry, and how that will affect deposit insurance, and then what the corporation should do in their own response. So I discovered that the insurance leaders from US, from Canada, Australia, most countries in Europe and Africa, 54 of them were in that webinar. So that was where I got my lesson. Oh, okay, so in a crisis, nobody is an expert. So what that then tells me is that when this particular government came in, they inherited an economy in crisis. So, like I said, in looking at a crisis, the first thing is, how do we survive? Because if we continue on the trajectory we're on, no doubt we're going to run into economic chaos. So the first thing was survival. So for me, that informed the choice of subsidy removal. And by the way, for me, interpretation, Tinubu didn't remove subsidy. He only implemented it. Buhari did. Because when Buhari signed the petroleum industry bill into an act, that was December 2021, he made a remark. He said, Section 205 to 208 of that act, which deal with subsidy removal, should not be implemented until 18 months' time. And I remember I made a joke about this on a live program on Channels Television, January 2022, when they asked me the question, what do you say about this president's remark? I said, well, I call him Baba. I said, Baba is smart. What Baba has done was carry the kind of subsidy
and
kick it
down the road for somebody else.
By 18 months. I said, look at 18 months to December 2021. That will be June 2023. I said, safely Baba would have left office because he would have finished his term, which would mean that whoever took over after him will carry the kind of first subsidy on his head. So it meant, number one, there was already an existing law, the Petroleum Industry Act, that Tinubu met when it was inaugurated. Number two, the budget for that year, which was now Appropriation Act, that Buhari also signed, had no provision for subsidy for the second half of the year. Which meant Tinubu came into office inauguration, he met two laws in place that had dealt away with subsidy. So in my interpretation, that if he said he will continue, that could become a ground for impeachment before even settling down in the office. That there are laws, two existing laws, that you are running counter. But again, if we are going to survive, throwing $10 billion annually, over $10 billion actually, annually, into first subsidy was not what I would say an effective investment. But it was not an investment because a lot of it also was fraudulent. Anyway, I won't go into all that. So on the one hand, then also the FX market. There was racketeering there, a whole lot of mess. So when you want to solve a problem like that, the best way to go is go to the market. Let the market sort it out for you. So that's why, yes, as of today, because when initially his government announced unification of exchange rates, I didn't like it. I must confess to you. I didn't like it. I challenged it. I went by historical data. And I said, look, anytime the Naira was devalued, it never regained the value it was before devaluation. And that contextually also, devaluation is not right for Nigeria. And contextually, it is not. Because when you devalue your currency, it is to make your exports competitive in the international market. That is, make it cheaper. And I said, let's look at our foreign trade.
We don't even have the exports.
If 90 to 92% of our export is hydrocarbons, on which you have no control over the price and even the volume that we export, it means 92% of our exports are outside of the benefit of devaluation. So that was the way I reasoned then. But if one looks at the other side to it, that look, there was a lot in terms of, sharp practices and shenanigans in that space. The best way to go was what they did. So that's why between then and now, my position on this has shifted. Initially, I criticized it. But now with the benefit of hindsight and the things that now came out that we all now knew, I said, okay, that was the best way to deal with that crisis. Yes, it has taken us from where we were to a new threshold. So if we are talking about exchange value of the Naira now, we are at a new level of equilibrium. That's the way I look at it. So it's about how do we keep it stable. And that takes my mind back to our industrial policy of 1988. I was involved in that because I was working for a company that the federal government gave that project to. And we went around several of our manufacturing entities in Nigeria in field surveys. Almost 98% of them said they were not worried about the exchange value of the Naira in terms of which level it was. But they were worried about the stability.
But aren't they connected though?
So
yeah, aren't they connected, like stability and value? I mean,
well, you see, you can have a currency stable, let's say at 500 Naira to $1, and it means if it is stable, you can plan.
Okay.
All right? But if it is unstable, it makes planning very difficult.
But isn't that utopian? Because that's suggesting that you want it to be fixed for a long time.
It will be fixed.
Okay.
Because, when it comes to the exchange rate management system, there are two extremes. In fact, we describe it as a continuum.
Yeah.
One extreme is floating. The other extreme is fixed. But there are also different arrangements in between them.
Yeah.
Okay, the crawling peg, the adjustable peg, the snake, and so many others in between. The managed float, all of them are in between those two extremes. Okay? So, but what we also say is that, yes, there's no currency that is freely floating anywhere in the world. And that's why what CBN did last week, that some analysts are criticizing, I have a different perspective to it. Because in central banking, the primary role of the central bank is to ensure exchange rate stability. So which means it will still move anyway. It can move quite all right. So in which case, it is not fixed at a particular level, but once it goes to a threshold that signals to you that the market is driving this in a particular direction that is not good for economic policy, then the central bank will intervene. And intervention, we also get it wrong in Nigerian interpretation. Intervention is not only about selling. Within context of intervention in the FX market, the CBN can also go to the market to buy. If they, for any reason, sense that the Naira is getting stronger than is implied by the economy and our external trade. It happened before in 1989. Okay? That was a time when the government stepped in the market and in fact began to buy dollars.
Buy dollars. Yeah.
Because Naira was artificially gaining value at that time. So we've seen it happen before, so it's not theory. So for me, therefore, what is happening now is that stability gives like a framework or a range within which the policymakers within CBN are watching the market. So if it goes above what they expect in terms of what other macroeconomic indices are saying, the CBN will go in and sell more. Now, if they sell the foreign currency, ideally Naira is supposed to gain value. So which means, again, everything runs around liquidity. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier, sustaining investor confidence.
Confidence, yeah.
So very, very important. And that is where the collaboration between fiscal and monetary authorities becomes very important.
I agree.
And also statements made by top government functionaries. I remember making a comment on that during President Jonathan's time. That his government got to a point where everybody was speaking. And they were all saying things contrary to one another. So when the media interviewed me about it, I said, look, his government had no voice. That was the way I put it. So every government should have a voice. There must be someone, exactly, will be someone that will speak, and you know that is the position of the government officially. Maybe, anyway.
All right, so, I mean, we're almost running out of time, but I really want us to touch on a few other topics as well.
Yes.
I want us to touch on debt as well.
Oh.
You're right. So I think the DMO just released our debt numbers. Yeah. Are you worried about Nigeria's, external debt or external and domestic debt or public debt figures? Or do you think it's just what should really happen if an economy is growing?
Very good question. I'm very happy you raised this issue. Now, from my perspective as a development-focused economist, I'm not more worried about debt. And my reason is simple. If you check out the history of the advanced economies, and I will pick out the West as a block, and then pick out the East Asian countries. None of them delivered what we call today world-class infrastructure without borrowing.
Mm.
I was in Frankfurt, Germany, I think about 3 years ago, for a master class in finance at Frankfurt, business school. And we went out, and someone told me that the rail within Frankfurt was constructed with borrowed funds some 40 years before that time, and they were still repaying.
Mm.
So I told myself, this rail we are traveling as old as it looks. So they borrowed money to do this, and they are still repaying it
40 years after.
I said, look, why should I then be so worried? I looked also what I talked about China earlier on, the infrastructure delivered. People think China has plenty of money, they just pour it in. So, but that infrastructure was also funded with public funds, borrowed funds. Okay? It's the same thing all around the world. In fact, the most leveraged economy in the world, the US economy.
Mm.
No doubt, because the government, corporate, households are heavily borrowed.
Leveraged. Yeah.
They're all leveraged. So now, what I then take from that is, it is not so much as borrowing, but what to do with the borrowed funds that matters. So where I see the gap in Nigeria is what I call value for money, which means if you borrow to do a road, and I use this Lagos-Calabar, expressway to illustrate, there's always this saying we had in my active days in NSG. I'm no longer as active as I used to be now. We used to make this remark that if government wants to develop any area, just build the road to that area. Investors will go in there and build houses, offices, and all.
Yeah.
For me, that's the way I interpret this superhighway that the government is constructing now. The cost may appear prohibitive. I must also drop something here. I've seen a master plan of this country that has this concept of this superhighway from Lagos to Calabar, Calabar to Maiduguri, Maiduguri to Sokoto, Sokoto to Badagry. I saw this 21 years ago.
So it's nothing new.
It's nothing new. So for me, therefore, as an analyst, my interpretation is that we've had successive presidents who didn't have courage enough to start it. Because I got that document 21 years ago that had that kind of concept. The same thing with super grids. Not the grid we have now that is collapsing at every little disruption here. Super grids were on that same map of Nigeria. And then, of course, apart from the road, railway. All these things were conceived many, many years back. But having the courage to do it is a matter of, look, if we are going to do this and borrow money, why not? Because for every axis you open up by building a road to it, all the economic activities they sprout along that route. That's my interpretation, the economic value of it. So if you borrow money to do a road, to do railway, to do, airports, terminal buildings, the rest of them, for me, you are creating value that will drive economic activities. If there's a particular route, let's say in Nigeria, I can fly to easily, that will encourage other people to fly to that route as well. So things will pick up.
But don't people always say, well, yes, debt is good if you're spending it well, but can you also pay for it?
Well, really, you see, the beauty
can
of
we pay for this debt?
When it creates the assets, that will help you also create or trigger economic activities. It is the flow back from those economic activities
that we used to pay
the debt. Okay? Let me use a road just to illustrate. You build a road with borrowed funds. You tow the road, okay? But along that road, several other economic activities pick up. Those activities, they pay taxes, so revenue increases. That revenue plus whatever toll you get on the road goes back to repay the debt. That's the way it's supposed to work, ideally.
But is that working?
If there are no leakages. That's where I'm going. If there are no leakages. But there are leakages on the one hand, and we've also borrowed money, not even for delivery of infrastructure, but for recurrent spending. So it was unproductive borrowing, mostly. That's why I said the focus for Nigeria should be value for money, which means if we must borrow at all, let's tie borrowings to projects. We should move away from all these suggestions by World Bank, IMF, that will give you support of this loan, a program support. Program is not the issue for Nigeria at this point. It should be projects. So there are three elements: policies, programs, projects. Focus should be on projects. Not programs. Or support, lending money to you for programs. I've worked for the World Bank before as a full-time staff. So I know the work is in there. If the World Bank lends money to you for a program, you can be sure that a good percentage of that will go back to the West.
To the West, yeah. Because they're the ones that
but they are professional, they will push to you to handle the programs.
Yeah. Okay, finally, sir, let's now end this with income inequality. There are a lot of young Nigerians today who see all these reforms. Yes, some of us who are probably, a lot more economic savvy understand where these reforms are going to, if well implemented, as I think I also agree with you. But people are suffering. There's a lot of pain. They don't really know whether they can wait any much longer, and you're seeing a huge gap between the rich and the poor. How does the government navigate through this within this short period?
All right, a very good question, and I think it's a very good point to also wrap this up. Now, there is what we've been saying over the years, and we termed social contract. Social contract means you give something to support what government is planning to do, and then in return for that, government will deliver this to you. But there's a recent definition of that as eco-social contract. No longer just social contract, which means we now separate between intervention, as in cash support, and intervention as investment.
Okay.
So what we now have found is studies, because I also am privileged to be on the editorial board of the Journals of BOI. We had our meeting last week, and in fact, one of the articles that was assigned to me for review dealt with this particular issue. And so the issue is that if this government is going to get value from these reforms to Nigerians, they should shift more focus on investments rather than cash dole out. Because all over the world, not just in Nigeria now, experience of subsidy removal has proven to be beneficial to people when government places more focus and attention on investment. It's investment in the people rather than on doling out cash to people. So, and also, it's important to do that very quickly. That is target between now and 2026.
What kind of investments?
And that is investment in capacity building.
Okay.
And that is because the more, the youth are empowered, the more capacity they have to create things. They can create jobs. In fact, the best thing, let me use as an example. If I create a job for myself, I'm out of the labor market. And if I now have an environment where my business can expand, I also employ more people. So value is therefore being created by investing in people. Now that talks about the soft infrastructure. Okay? Investment in health.
Okay.
Because a healthy population is also good for productivity.
Yes.
So in which case you are taking education, you are taking health. And if education it is focused on skills required in the era we are in, not the skills that we learned when we were in school. Those ones are dated.
Dated now.
But 21st century skills that can make them competitive. Is there a possibility that I can empower a Nigerian youth here that will be able to compete internationally, sitting back in Nigeria and taking international jobs and actually earning foreign currencies? It's already happening. But they need to deepen that. That's where I'm going. They need to deepen that, invest more in that. Okay? So they invest more in that, it impacts them directly. And I'm talking about especially our youth. We represent about 70% or a little bit more of our population.
Yeah.
That's quite a huge number. So if we focus more on that, education, their health, what we call the soft infrastructure, that will do a lot in ameliorating
some of the pain. But this investment can take a long time then. Are there any short-term ones that can immediately deliver the kind of results they're looking for?
Well, an idea flight in my mind, and it's a very funny one. This is by one of those old, political sages.
Yes.
Obafemi Awolowo.
Yes.
He said, when you're in a crisis of this nature, and you have so many unemployed people, that the first thing government can do is think about any job you can put them into. Even if you go to an extreme of saying, give them equipment to dig the ground. And when they dig to a particular depth, they refill it again.
So long as they have a job.
So long as they have
income.
a job. And we saw a model of that played out in Lagos when Fashola came into office in 2007.
Yes. When he had
his first budget, 20 billion naira for greening Lagos.
Yes.
So, okay, employ these unemployed youths, and then they start planting flowers and grasses. And after that, we give you fresh contract to maintain them. So in doing that, they took off many of the area boys. But once you employ them also, they become responsible citizens because you deduct tax from what you pay them.
It has multiplier effects.
They start paying taxes as well. And my interpretation, and that's where we drop it, was that if a man had been planting grass and flowers from morning in this hot sun, by the time he gets to evening, he's so tired. All he's looking for is a place to sleep. Not going to make trouble for someone in the night. Okay? So if you do that, you've taken him away from the social vices, but at the same time, you are making him a responsible citizen. Because he earns money, yes, he also pays taxes. So his psyche begins to change that I can actually earn a living. So that's where government comes in. That's investment in the people. So you look at projects of that nature so that you can introduce innovative, creative ways of thinking that will make jobs that are good for the society, but also will take some of the youth that are unemployed.
So basically, investment in job creating ventures.
That's in job creating ventures.
Thank you so much, Doc. Really, really appreciate this discussion. It's been an engaging one, an insightful one. This has been Talknomics with Nairametrics, and of course, we've had Dr. Biodun Adedipe. It's been such an instructive. I actually didn't want this to end, but we just had to end it now. I hope that we can have you again here sometime soon so that we can dissect a lot more. We hadn't even gone through half of what I wanted us to talk about. We hadn't even gone into consumer credit. We haven't gone into a whole lot of things, that I really wanted us to talk about. But I think we will leave this for next time. Of course, do give us your feedback. If there are questions or people that you want me to have on this show, do let me know, and we will try as much as possible to have them here. I'm sure that we've all learned. I'm sure that you're all listening, particularly those in government, from some of the important nuggets that Doc has actually dropped today. Thank you all very much. And until we do this again next time, do have a profitable day ahead.